Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Grace and peace be with you on this day. So whoever said it was easy to be a Christian does not really fully understand the teachings of Jesus. I tell you, it takes courage to be a Christian, especially when we are trying to live the Christian faith in the manner that Jesus taught us to do so. It took courage back in the first century, and it takes courage today. Today's scripture passage is about Jesus the revolutionary. You may not really quite think so, but this is truly a passage that goes to show how Jesus was creating a movement that was very revolutionary for its day. He was trying to change the world through love. The message of Jesus eventually got him killed because it threatened the power structure of the temple and of the priesthood. It changed the image of God to one that no longer worked for the temple priesthood and into an image that worked for the people. Just flipping it around completely. And as you read through the Gospels, you will see that there are many, many instances, many quotes of Jesus where he's doing that. One that immediately comes to mind is when he was being criticized for his disciples and for him doing work during the Sabbath. And his answer was, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Turning things completely around. Now, for those of you who know me, you might guess that I was a pretty mischievous and energetic child. I had a propensity to get in trouble. If something went wrong, even if there were no witnesses, there was a good chance I got blamed for it. Because there was a good chance I had something to do with it. My partner in crime was usually my cousin Jose. Jose, who's just a little bit younger than I, but he's definitely more mischievous and more energetic than I am, even to this day. And together we would spend weekends, sleep at each other's homes, spend a lot of Saturdays scheming up ways to cause havoc in the neighborhood and in our parents' home. There were many, many instances where our grandfather, upon entering the house, would smack us on the head. And then I go, "What was that for?" And he goes, "For whatever you did of which I didn't catch." Now, I have to tell you that my mother took it all in stride. Well, not really. She did have at her disposal a wooden spoon and a boomerang sandal. But for the most part, she didn't lose her composure. For the most part, I received that knock on the head or that sandal on the side, but when I would turn around, she would just continue with whatever she was doing. This, I put her in comparison to my aunt, Jose's mother, who, when it was her turn, she would be all red in the face. Her hair would find a way to get undone, and her rage would mushroom like an atomic bomb. I still remember how she would pull at her sleeves and keep her arms down, and I realize now that it was an effort to keep herself from smacking us around. And then, of course, she always would end with the last and final threat, which, by the way, carried a lot of weight. You just wait. You just wait till your father gets home. Now, that father she was talking about was my uncle. And my uncle was a hardworking man. First-generation Cuban exiles trying to make a living in the United States. The man worked non-stop to provide for the family. And he built a very, very impressive business. And he would come late at home, just completely exhausted, having to listen to this tedious complaint of how the children misbehaved. So he did what was easiest. He just told us, face the wall, turn around. He took off his belt. He rapped us a few times with it, and it was done. He would walk away. And then we would, depending on what age we were, because this kind of went on for a while, we would either cry or, as the years went on, just grin and bear it. And we learned how to grin and bear it. I have to tell you that my skinny little rear end really did teach me a few lessons. And I realized years later that it's the sort of parenting that nowadays would get some people in serious trouble. Even when I was a young dad, it's a sort of parenting that I contemplated, but didn't necessarily cross that line. Now, I don't want to get nostalgic on you, reminiscing about my childhood and how growing up on a Caribbean island was pretty fantastic. I did have to receive a few smacks on the head and a few belts on my rear end, but it was that generation's way of making sure that I learned the boundaries and that I would stay alive. And it must have worked, because here I am. But why have I traveled back to my childhood? Why has my mind gone back to the days when a strong parent was feared? It has to do with today's scripture lesson. And it has to do with our image of God. Most importantly, the image of God in first century Jerusalem. You see, first century Judaism taught that the pathway to God was through the laws of Moses. Keep the laws, all 613 of them, and you would experience God's favor. Break the laws, and God would pull out his belt and impart a swift punishment. This type of conditional love led to the image of God as a strong parent, one that needed to be feared. Now, I got to tell you that Jesus also used the image of a parent. Jesus very, very often used that in his lessons, in his parables, and in his prayer. But he softened the image into one of a loving and forgiving parent. Think of the parable of the prodigal son. The father does not pull out his belt, but rather takes out the fatted calf and welcomes his son back into the house. Think of the Lord's Prayer and how there's not one hint of judgment or punishment in that prayer, and yet it begins with our Father. Definitely, Jesus had an image of God that helped change our understanding of how love works and how the Holy Spirit works. But back in first century Jerusalem, the image of God as a strong parent ready to impart justice and punishment was working very well for the temple priesthood, because the temple priesthood had to keep the laws, had to keep control, and it was actually part of the oppressive system along with the Roman Empire of the poor people. The image of a strong parent has worked throughout the ages as governments have used that image of God to hold on to their power and justify their oppression of the people. But that image does not work for the common person who is struggling to make ends meet and who is struggling to understand why there is so much injustice in the world. Which is why the message of Jesus centers around the God of love. We see it first with the Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel to be written. And by the time the Gospel of John comes into being, a good 40 years later, we have John in his gospel and letters saying, God is love. He's not quantifying, saying God the Father loves us or God is a loving parent. No. He's saying God is love. So instead of the parent who pulls out a belt, this is the parent who loves instead. In order to make God's love real, we must live it ourselves. The love of God must be in our hearts. It must be exemplified in our homes, in our workplace, and in our lives. And just how do we do that? Well, begin by reading Luke chapter 6. And read it from the point of view of someone who is trying to change the world. Read it from the point of view of someone who is trying to lead a grassroots movement of, if we change the people, we will change the world. Teaching nonviolence and peaceful defiance. And instead of retaliation that would further violence and pain, there's love and grace. In Luke 6, we see Jesus creating a movement of people who are so strong that they are fearless. They are completely just made out of steel. Imagine that. People who are not afraid of getting hurt. And they are so strong that after they've been hit, they turn the other cheek. They're not afraid of going without. That after their coat has been taken, they give their shirt away. They become so generous enough and so mature in their faith that they pray for those who mistreat them. They bless those who curse, and they forgive those who injure. In Luke 6, we see that to be a follower of Jesus is to rise above the mediocre malaise that infects our land and fills our minds with silly notions. To be a follower of Jesus is to embody a love so strong that it does not yield to hatred, greed, and ignorance. For anyone who doubts the power behind the message of Luke 6, we do not need to look too far away, nor do you need to look too far back in time. It has been exemplified in our lifetime and in our country. Luke 6 was on every newspaper and on every channel. Amazing, each and every one of us. Allow me to remind you of recent history. We had just lived through a very violent season, a season that divided our country, a season that began summer of 2014 and continued well into summer of 2015. A season of racial tension, of people protesting on the streets, of riots, and all sorts of divisions. And in the midst of that time, black people were calling for justice and change. Racial tension was palpable in just about every city and every community, and regardless of whether you were affected directly by this, it affected you indirectly to watch it. Transport yourself back to that time, and you will feel your heart begin to race. You will begin to feel that tension which is burbling up in us because it really wasn't too long ago. And in many ways, we're still living with it. And towards the end of that season, in June of 2015, a self-admitted white supremacist set out to start a race war in South Carolina. South Carolina, a state with a deep history of racism and racial injustice. You remember the name, Dylann Roof. He went to a prayer vigil of an African-American church, historically black, and there he shot and killed 9 African Americans who had gathered peacefully to pray. What was the response? 48 hours after the massacre, when everything was still very fresh in everybody's heart, mind, and soul, and the city was about to erupt into the type of anger that is destructive and painful, the family members of the victims of Dylann Roof came to the courthouse for his bond hearing, and they publicly forgave him. They exemplified and embodied Luke chapter 6. Forgiveness, nonviolence, grace. And not just grace, amazing grace. 5 years after that tragedy, a documentary was filmed, Emmanuel, named after the church, Emmanuel AME Church, where the attack happened. And the purpose of the documentary is to teach the power of forgiveness, to put out there for everyone to see how powerful forgiveness can be. And the documentary narrates the compelling story that puts a face and a name to the message of Jesus in the gospel. Nadine Collier, who lost her mother, Ethel Lance, to Dylann Roof at that bond hearing in the courthouse, she said, "I forgive you. You took something really precious from me. I will never talk to her again. I will never be able to hold her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul." Now notice the language there. Normally we say, "And may God have mercy on your soul." But Nadine embodied it completely and said, "And I have mercy on your soul." In the documentary, a young man by the name of Chris Singleton is interviewed. His mother was shot and killed by Dylann Roof. And in this movie, he says the following words: "There is a narrative about forgiveness that makes it look like submission and that you're weak. People think that. But I've realized that forgiving is so much tougher than holding a grudge. It takes a lot more courage to forgive than to be angry and resentful. To be angry is easy. Anyone could do that." End quote. Anyone could do that. He's channeling the very last few words we read from Luke chapter 6. And at that bond hearing, 48 hours after the massacre, after that forgiveness was voiced, it spread. It became contagious. And a city that could have erupted out into a race war the way that Dylann Roof intended began to forgive. The battle was fought and won, but this time with a different sort of weapon, and the weapon being love. Jesus is teaching us in Luke chapter 6 how to love. He's teaching us how to love in such a way that it could not only transform us as individuals, but then transform entire communities. And we see in this documentary, Emmanuel, how love could lead people to forgive. This documentary is one worth watching. I highly recommend it. Look it up. Everyone should see it. But I have to tell you that sadly, there is a new wave of racism that is in the near future going to keep us from showing it. In South Carolina, where the attack happened, a law is being proposed to prevent public schools and university professors from teaching lessons about racism because it might create feelings of discomfort and guilt. In other words, in the city of Charleston where the crime happened, it would be a crime, possibly punishable by jail, to show the movie Emmanuel and discuss with the students why Dylann Roof went into that church on the night of June 17th, 2015, to kill innocent black people. Sadly, it's not only in South Carolina. It's a movement that is sweeping through our land, showing its ugly head at school board meetings and legislative halls, proposing laws that would make it a crime to show a movie on the basis that it would make somebody feel uncomfortable. And since January 2021, 35 states have introduced 137 bills limiting what schools could teach with regard to race, American history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity, whom to love and whom not to love. New laws are being passed that say, do not make me uncomfortable, I'm too fragile. Now, I got to tell you that as a pastor, I hear that often. Too often we are getting from people sermons that have made them uncomfortable, and they kind of just would rather not that we don't touch the subject. But the subject is there in Luke chapter 6. It is there, it is biblical. How it is that we ought to love, how it is that we ought to stand to injustice. And unlike many angry protesters who loot and riot, we ought to do it with nonviolence. We ought to do it with peace. We ought to stand firm and say, yes, you slapped me, and guess what? Here's the other cheek, slap me again. Yes, you've taken from me, but it's okay. My faith is strong. You could take from me again. You took my coat, here's my shirt. Yes, you have offended me, but I'm going to pray for you. Yes, you have hurt me, but I'm going to forgive you. Friends, I have many questions about the character of our present times. Too often, I look at what's going on and I'm wondering just what exactly have we done? What kind of a generation have we raised that certain things just can no longer be said? People are too fragile to hear it. It raises questions about our character, especially if we allow for such laws in South Carolina to pass. Did it make me feel uncomfortable when I saw the movie Emmanuel? You bet it did. I felt very uncomfortable. And by golly, I think that was the intention. Uncomfortable because the human nature to hate is still present. To be violent is still present. Stupidity, if you want to call it that, is still present. But I am hopeful. I am ever so hopeful because I see so many more people that are rising above it. I see it here in my own community of St. Petersburg. I see it here in this church and in the pews among us. A willingness to take a look at the difficult subjects and talk about them. That from this lectern, a church member should stand forward and ask you to be a part of a conversation that just might make you uncomfortable in a program called Dinners for Change. That people from this church might be able to sign up and learn about how it is that we could be better when it comes to these ills that have been plaguing us for so many decades, if not centuries. I am grateful and hopeful. It gives me the energy to continue to love and to promote love, even if it might be considered illegal by those who prefer to hate. It will be difficult, I know, but nobody said that Christianity would be easy. I may have to disagree with family members, with members from my own neighborhood and even political party, but that is the cost of following Jesus. Jesus is calling us to be strong and fearless, to fear not, stand up to injustice, name it, and fight against it with the best weapon we have, love. I'm not going to pull out my belt. I'm just going to love you. Amen.